Rising. That's the conversation we're going to have later on in the show as well. Again, 011 714 2006. That's the number to dial. 0614 104 107. That's where you can send your WhatsApp voice notes. This is This Week Today. My name is Oliver Dickson. Let's get started.
At SAfm Radio and at Oliver_speaking on Twitter.
And we're going to jump straight into it. I'm going to start this conversation with Matthew Parks from COSATU, because it's important that we take the opinion and understand the argument for why it is the case that COSATU thinks that it's irresponsible, or perhaps not the best response to inflation, that the Reserve Bank increased its in the rate of the repayment rate, right, repo rate, or as we colloquially call it, the interest rate. Matthew, why is it a problem?
Well, it's a problem because it's going to bleed workers of the salaries. The salaries already overstretched. Workers struggle to pay the bills, to take care of their families, to transport their children to school, pay the loans to the banks. With the repo rate hike of 75 points, which is a huge hike, it's the largest hike in 20 years, in fact. That means that maybe today you're paying 1,500 Rand on your loans. Well, maybe tomorrow you'll be paying 2,000 Rand a month on your loans. So it's money out of workers' pockets to pay for the very same loans they already had. We understand the issue of managing inflation. We also are worried about inflation. It's at 7.4%. That's quite high. It's the highest in many years. But the reasons for the inflation are not within South Africa's control or fault or responsibility. It's because of the war in Ukraine, which has sent international oil prices skyrocketing. That's why inflation is jumping. There's nothing we as South Africa can do about the war in Ukraine, nothing we can do about the international oil price. So there's a domestic, imported factors for the inflation. So what is the Reserve Bank going to do when the war continues in Ukraine and international oil price continues to go up? Fuel prices continue to go up next month and the month after. Are they going to continue to increase the repo rate? At what cost? Because it suffocates the economy. It means workers have less money to pay for the food, to take care of the families. It means businesses have less money to sell the goods, to produce the goods, to hire and to pay workers. So are we going to increase the repo rate to the point that we bludgeon the economy into total collapse? Because that's the question. But we think that's in the pressure of the Reserve Bank. There's not much they can do, to be honest. We actually feel that the real frustration should be directed at government, which is in essence outsourced the responsibility for managing the economy to the Reserve Bank, which only really has one tool, the repo rate, at its disposal, a few other smaller ones. And for us, there are two things government could have done immediately to help lessen inflation, which would have then helped to reduce the pressure on the Reserve Bank to take such actions. Government could reduce the fuel price. We pay about 32% of the fuel price goes towards taxes. That's about 9 Rand a litre. Government could reduce that. They had promised, the two ministers of finance and mineral and energy had promised in May they're going to review and reduce the fuel price regime. That could have been done. That could have been done quickly. They can still do it. That would give immediate relief to workers and to the economy, to commuters, that will help to dissipate inflation. And in fact, in 2018, when Jeff Radebe was Minister of Energy, he had also made the same promise. And it's 4 years later, nothing has been done. The second thing we think government could do quite quickly would also help to reduce one of the major causes of inflation is to give assistance to Eskom. Eskom's got a debt level of 400 billion Rand, which they cannot afford. That's partly why they go after these huge tariff hikes all the time. That's why they've asked for a 32% tariff hike now. So we had offered assistance to government. We had told government ways to help reduce the Eskom debt burden 2.5 years ago. If we can do that, that will help reduce the need for Eskom to go after these huge tariff hikes. So those are two things which government can do something quickly about, but they just seemingly want to sleepwalk us into a crisis. And really, it is at a huge cost to the economy and to workers.
Before we move on, I really want us to dig into some of the administered pricing concepts that you raised there, which government has direct control over. So you're absolutely right. Government determines how much you and I pay for petrol in this country. That has a ripple effect throughout the economy because it determines the movements of goods and services and how much we then pay for that. Government also can determine how much we pay for electricity at various levels. At a national level, NERSA regulates pricing there. Eskom asks for certain things from NERSA to make sure that the pricing is in line with their financial objectives. And at a local government level, Local municipalities have direct control over what premium or an additional levy they put on that so that they can administer services as a local government institution. All of those things are important. We can speak about other administered prices, such as the cost for, I don't know, taking a bus or the train fare for most workers. Most of South Africa's workforce takes trains. Rely on rapid bus transport systems. There it is again, mostly government, and not exclusively, but mostly government that determines those sorts of prices. Government has also at its disposal a zero VAT rated basket, right, which they can add more things into and perhaps even subsidize some things within that basket beyond just removing the VAT burden on it. But I want us to drill into each one of those in a very short while, and I prefer that we start with Eskom. You say that government could have, and 2.5 years ago you gave government a recommendation on how it could reduce Eskom's debt burden. How can it do so? It's 400, well, it's less than that now, but at the time it was 400 billion, which at the time was a third of our fiscal.
No, there is space. We had offered assistance from the PIC front. The PIC has about 104 billion rand invested in Eskom through government guaranteed bonds. They could negotiate with the PIC for easier terms of payment. They could ask the PIC to buy additional bonds. They could look at the option of giving the PIC equity so PIC can own a stake in Eskom as well. Government can also take some of Eskom's debt onto the fiscal balance sheet as well and renegotiate some of those terms with the lenders as well. There are a variety of options, but right now, if we simply say it's up to Eskom alone, well, then Eskom will transfer the cost for those debt to consumers, to you and I. And that is why for the past 15 years, they've been going with these double-digit inflation, above inflation increases every single year. And all it's doing is to suffocate the economies, to bleed workers out of salaries, make it more difficult for companies to operate, and so on. If we had managed to alleviate half of the Eskom debt burden 2 years ago, it would have enabled Eskom to focus more on maintenance, which should have helped us to avoid the massive amount of load shedding we're having currently. Load shedding itself bleeds the economy of billions of rands every single day. Again, so if you had invested 200 billion rand that time, we could have probably saved about 300 billion rand worth of damages to the economy through load shedding. So for us, really, it is something which we can control. There's nothing we can do about Ukraine. Absolutely nothing. Nothing we can do about the international oil price. But assisting Eskom, that's something which we can easily do. Reviewing the fuel price regime, again, it's something which we can easily do. There's other more medium-term interventions which we need to do as well, which can help to dissipate inflation. If we can get our railway network fully operational, secured, our trains, both metro rail for passengers, that assists 10 million commuters in our cities to get to work at a cheaper rate, at a more subsidized rate, get them out of cars, and so they're less exposed to fuel price hikes. If we can get Transnet freight fully operational, that assists with farmers to transport the food to the cities on rail as opposed to trucks. So that helps to protect food from excessive inflation. Again, if we got Transnet to work properly, our commodities could have exploited the boom. Our mining exports could have exploited the mining boom, and that would have meant additional revenue to the state, additional money into the economy. So these are kind of the fundamental things which are quite within our grasp and control. If you want to secure the railway network, deploy the defense force to secure the lines, provide the police railway unit, ban scrap, copper and steel exports, regulate the scrap dealers. Again, those are the things you can control. We can't do anything about Ukraine. It's very far away. We're not too worried what we think about life, but there are things which we can do as a nation quickly.
Yeah. Raila Sushkin, Head of Research at Bungela Global Fund Managers, I want to bring you into this conversation. Are we leaving fiscal and industrial policy out of the conversation as a country in ways that is detrimental to our economic recovery, in particular to cushion us against the global inflation rally? And are we unfairly, almost exclusively, using monetary policy to respond to that question?
Hi, Oliver. I think Matthew has made very good points on the fiscal side, and there's no doubt that the government can do more on the fiscal side to encourage growth. And growth is one of the ways that we can really try and alleviate sort of higher inflation over the very long term. But looking at the short term, first of all, the Reserve Bank, they've got a single mandate, and that mandate is to maintain inflation and price stability. And one of the core things that drives our prices is our currency and how our rand trades to the dollar. Because we import a lot of goods, and one of the key imports is oil. So while we don't have control over the USD oil price, our management of our currency certainly impacts our rand oil price. And so, the Reserve Bank is reacting to, I suppose, a global trend that the rest of the world is reacting to as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war. Globally, food prices are higher. Globally, oil prices are higher. And so we see central banks across the world increasing interest rates. And if the Reserve Bank doesn't maintain parity or increases in line with that of the U.S., what we have seen is already when our Reserve Bank was behind, we saw the rand weaken extremely quickly over the last probably week or two. If we had not increased interest rates, that rand would continue to weaken at probably an even faster pace, which would mean everything we import into the country would be a lot more expensive, and that would drive inflation even higher. And I think that's one of the key reasons why increasing the interest rate at the rate that they have is necessary.
Matthew, I want to bring you back in here. Rela makes an interesting point, right, saying that from a fiscal side, you're making a lot of sense and raising a lot of valuable points, but there's an opportunity cost to what you're saying, Rela says. And the opportunity cost is that it takes a while to actualize the nominal gains of fiscal progression, whereas opposed to an adjustment in monetary positioning means that the relief is almost immediate. And what this requires, given that it's a time-sensitive issue, is immediate relief.
Yeah, look, I think for us, so ESCOM, sure, that's not immediate relief. That's going to take some time and so forth. That's more medium term. But that's one of the kind of fundamental things we need to deal with. But adjusting the fuel price, that provides immediate relief. Treasury did it in May. It gave immediate relief of R1.50 a litre for 2.5 months, so to speak. So that's what we're focusing on, because that's something we can do tomorrow. That's completely within government's control. I mean, to give relief, it's administratively efficient. Government announces it, petrol stations implement it, and everybody who goes to put in petrol, be it a commuter, be it a farmer, be it a person going to work, be it a taxi driver, etc., it goes down to the economy, it hits everybody as you want immediately, just like a repo rate hike hits everybody in the wrong way immediately as well. Of course, people can ask, well, if you reduce the fuel price regime, it will affect the fiscus, which is true, because I think we get about 90 billion rand a year from fuel prices, taxes, sorry. There is the simple way to address that equation. Give more resources to the South African Revenue Service, because under the new commissioner of SARS, Kisvetter, they've been quite good at turning the ship around. They appointed an additional 500 staff at SARS last year. They've invested more in the SARS IT infrastructure, which has enabled them to go after people who don't pay taxes. So not new taxes, just the enforcement of existing taxes. That, in this budget, generated an additional 60 billion rand. Just that alone.
Yeah.
So if you give additional 10 billion rand to SARS, they can recover whatever we would lose from a fuel tax relief. So that's the simple point. It's quick and we can do it quite efficiently.
Rela, quickly pull out your crystal ball there. Why is government prevaricating around the petrol price?
I think government has a very, very tight budget as it is. I certainly do think it could provide immediate relief, cutting the tax on petrol. But as we know, commodity prices have dipped over the first half of this year, and so a large part of our strong revenues from last year came from higher commodity prices. With economic growth looking pretty low over the next few years, that tax collection is going to be under pressure. What we don't need is to increase our budget deficit even more. What that could mean that our rating agencies downgrade us even further, which would mean further weakening of the rand, and actually ultimately might result in the Reserve Bank increasing interest rates even further.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a long-term view, but there is a sort of a circular impact of that.
Yeah. It's sort of a golden staircase, Matthew, if you will, right? Because Rela makes a very good point. If you increase your budget deficit, it means you either have less for social spending, which workers rely on quite a bit, or you have to borrow more money. And the borrowing market isn't very friendly right now given what is on offer at an interest rate level on some of these loans. Not all of the loans we're going to get are going to be special concession cheap loans from the IMF or the World Bank or any other Bretton Woods institution that's willing to give money to developing worlds. The cheap ones we got came off of the back of a COVID response. We're kind of past that now. We've got those loans and we moved on from those. If we were to borrow more money, that puts our debt to GDP ratio on even more strain. Rela says the ripple impact of that is ratings agencies looking at us unfavorably, meaning that we will once again down the line have to use monetary policy to respond to those issues. So why is it that government should scrap away the 9 rand in levies and taxes that we pay on petrol per litre to be able to create, to cushion consumers, but then the impact of it means that lower tax collections, bigger budget deficit?
Look, first, we're not saying the government must get more into debt. We've been raising the debt concern for quite some time, but we think there are ways to grow the economy, to create jobs, and to assist with resolving the fiscal crisis, the debt crisis. So we think number one is simply give more money to the South African Revenue Service. If you give them 10 billion rand, they will generate an additional 50 billion rand in tax collection. We have a tax compliance
Is that a 10 billion in operational spending?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so we have a tax compliance rate of about 60%. The European average, and let's leave aside the bad comparisons, is about 90%. If we can just increase it by, say, 5%, that's an additional 100 billion rand. Even if you increase it by 2.5%, it's an additional 50 billion rand. So that is one thing, and that's partly why we've seen under the past year they've managed to recover an additional 60 billion rand over previous years. The Mbeki administration had done so well because Pravin Gordhan build the infrastructure which was destroyed under the Zuma era. So we need to do that. Again, if we can help Eskom avoid load shedding, that enables companies to operate, enables them to generate profits, and that contributes towards tax collections. If we can secure Transnet, freight and ports, that will enable us to export more and much more efficiently our mining, exports, manufacturing, agriculture. We've really lost out on the commodities boom over the past year because Transnet was struggling both at freight rail and at ports. So again, if you invest there, you secure the railway lines, that's going to enable these critical sectors of the economy to operate.
Yeah.
If you can enable metro rail to operate efficiently, it improves productivity in the city. So if you do those fundamental hard work, that's the solution to the crisis.
Yeah. Rela, I want to circle back to a point you made earlier, is that part of the problem with the South African economy structurally is that we're a net importer and not a net exporter, which means we spend more money on converting our rand to dollars and less money, and not enough of those dollars, pounds, euros and yen is being converted to rand coming into the economy. And that means the strength of our currency matters for consumers, right? How do we change that around?
I think it very much talks to what Matthew's speaking to in terms of fiscal policy. It's really all about job creation. I think if we had to create local industry, any sort of manufacturing industry, and for example, we've seen a lot of our large listed retailers bringing clothing manufacturing back to South Africa. If we had the right incentives to grow our manufacturing within South Africa, it would mean importing less goods into the country. Unfortunately, oil, we don't have those, massive resources here. That's something that's we're always going to have to import.
Yeah. Matthew, what are the low-hanging fruits? Have you ever had a look at them when it comes to importing? What are we importing that we really shouldn't be importing at this stage?
Many things. So we have 20 industrial master sector plans, which includes government, business and labor, looking at key sectors of the economy, which really can create jobs, real economic opportunities. Some are moving down quite far, like the clothing and textiles master plan. We're seeing some green shoots around poultry, around sugar, around agriculture and so forth. Others are quite far behind, like minerals and renewable energy, tourism, hospitality, creative arts. But there are many opportunities. I think what we can do as consumers is to buy locally produced clothes and shoes, locally produced food, even sugar. Check the labels at the supermarket and so on. When people go and buy cars, there's opportunities to buy locally produced cars as well. We've been having some engagement with some of the big retailers to say, can you, on your shelf, stock locally produced sugar, for example, or poultry, etc., clothes and so on. Also, big companies like the mining companies can do a bit more. They can buy locally produced machinery, locally produced uniforms and so forth. government itself can do much more. They can, in terms of the government fleet, it's a huge fleet. Government is a huge procurer of food, from hospitals to prisons to universities to schools. So there is real significant scales of economies there, which if we're a bit creative, a bit more efficient, we can do much more. But at times it also does feel like we're a bit kind of just going through the lip service processes. Then you'll find, when people have conferences, you check the t-shirts that are produced or the bags, they're made in China. So there are real opportunities for us to do it. But also what we're doing besides just appealing to people to buy locally produced goods is say, what are some of the structural obstacles to helping local industries become more efficient? I think if you address that makes them to become cheaper, and that's the real long-term solution. So it's about electricity, about water, it's about transport, it's about the machinery, it's about access to capital, about the skills the workers have, and so forth. So I think for us, those are the longer-term things, but we can as consumers also do a bit more to help give solidarity to local manufacturing sectors, because that's the real solution to growing the economy, creating jobs.
Yeah. I want to speak about something that we pretended to speak about when President Ramaphosa became President Rela in 2019 or so. And the first thing he did was this massive, what he called a stimulus package. But when you really looked at it, there was very little stimulus in the stimulus package. I always understood in classic economic terms, stimulus means putting more money into the economy, into the hands of people. The first real stimulus I saw was during COVID, right? When there was a reduction on taxes on certain things, when there was a reduction in the interest rate itself, when more money was put back into the hands of the consumers. Should we consider stimulus around this time, given that what's happening in Russia and Ukraine is beyond our control? And if we are to consider stimulus, what should it look like?
Yeah, I think stimulus would be great to have, but I think where we're sitting from a budget point of view and a budget deficit point of view, it's very difficult for the government over the short term at least, until you put in all these structural changes that Matthew's talking about to afford such a package. I agree with you that the COVID grant was sort of the first monetary stimulus that we had. I think Ramaphosa had talked about business investment or foreign direct investment as one of the ways to grow the economy, which makes a lot of sense. I think again, it comes back to our fiscal policy. In order for businesses and for foreigners to invest in our economy, we need stable policies and we also need stable infrastructure. Without ESCOM working properly, without Transnet working efficiently, it's very difficult to attract that kind of investment.
Should we consider maybe putting more government bonds into the market?
I don't think that's going to be a long-term solution. Again, we're talking about, adding to the government debt balance. And again, that comes back down to currency and how important that is, how that runs through the economy.
Matthew, what do you make of that? Should we consider putting more government bonds in the market, firstly? And if we were to consider a stimulus package, a real stimulus package, what should it look like beyond in your initial answer, reducing the price on electricity tariffs, reducing the price on petrol? Beyond that, what other stimulus package, what else should we look at in a package of that sort that's real and not just, platitudes?
It's a difficult one because we are fearful of government's debt rising too much. We don't want to go the Greek route or the Irish route when your loans are called in and then you're in real trouble, because then you lose your ability to make your own decisions and you put at risk your social grant, your social services and so forth. But we think there are some things. So we have managed to amend Regulation 28, which allows pension funds to invest in infrastructure. So that we think it's been effective quite recently, about 2 weeks ago. We're hoping that will help to unlock a significant amount of stimulus into the economy. But it does mean that those infrastructure investment opportunities for pension funds have to make sense to those pension funds. They have to provide a healthy return on investments to those pension funds. We think there is a need to have an engagement with the Public Investment Corporation about how can it invest in the economy in a way which grows the economy a bit more. How can it tamp down some of the speculative investments in shopping centers which don't really help grow the economy. We'll look at more investing in productive sector of the economy, agriculture, mining, manufacturing, so forth. A little bit less maybe of investments overseas. We were a bit worried when government actually increased in Regulation 28, allowing overseas investments for pension funds to go from 40% to 45%. But also we do think we need to have a situation where the banks say to government, what can they help to actually contribute to investing more in the economy? Because as you're saying, government has got limited fiscal reserves. It cannot do everything on its own.
Yeah.
So the banks also need to inject a bit more because, look, our backlog is so huge. Government on its own will never have enough reserves. Our backlog on road maintenance, I think it's about, 800 billion rand. There's just not enough space for government to do it. But I think maybe lastly, for us, the real kind of opportunity is, again, sorry to be a bit of a broken record player. It's around tax collection, not new taxes, just enforcing the existing tax collection, because that alone, that 60% to 90%, that gap, if we can begin to narrow it, it really will inject huge amounts into the fiscal space, help it to pay down the debt, help it to invest in the economy, help it to invest in infrastructure.
Yeah. Rela, maybe just a final question as we reach the end of the conversation here. Matthew alludes to it, right? But doesn't quite make the point explicitly. There's a lot of liquidity in private hands in South Africa. In excess of 2 trillion rand of actual liquidity. What role does the private sector have in making sure that money circulates a little bit more than it currently does to protect consumers against inflation and a shrinking economy?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, there is a lot of liquidity in the country. I think I'm going to go back to my previous point. I think our local companies have been great at reinvesting in the country, and they've been investing in areas where they don't necessarily have to, but they do so because it's for the greater good of the economy. As government, they're trying to fill the gaps where government is not. So surrounding their manufacturing facilities, for example, they're improving infrastructure on their own accord. Again, I think if they had the correct larger infrastructure support, again, coming back to Eskom, coming back to Transnet, you wouldn't have to have the private sector sort of investing in projects just to maintain the economy. They could be focusing on rather growth, on creating new jobs, and I think that's the key.
Yeah. Matthew, does the private sector have a special mandate here with its vast liquidity?
We think we do. And, as COSATU, we've always supported the principle of social compacts, where government, business and labor all contribute something, or possibly compromise and sacrifice for a greater national good. There's only so much government can do. There's only so much business can do. There's only so much labor can do. But if we work collectively together, we can all contribute. And to be honest, our frustration with business at times has been that we thought they made many demands on government, which is right. Government must address administrative issues in SOEs, issues of governance, corruption, and so forth, which are in its responsibility. But business also has to contribute. We've seen many companies move to Europe to, off listing. We've seen many companies rather choosing to import as opposed to buying locally produced goods. We've seen many companies in the mining sector, for example, refusing to pay workers an additional 150 rand a month, but paying a CEO 300 million rand a year. We think there's much more that business can do. We've seen at times businesses which are doing very well, like in the banking sector, rushing to retrench workers. The big four banks actually all retrenched about 2,000 workers over the past few years before COVID, when actually they have so much reserves, they actually could have absorbed those workers, maybe reskill them, redeploy them, but those alternatives to retrenchment. And we're saying that because you have an economy of 45% unemployment, who is going to buy our goods if people are unemployed? Who's going to buy our goods if we pay people a slave wage? Yet at the same time, you have the CEOs paying themselves so much money. The CEOs of the banks make about 150 million rand a year. Yet they're paying cashiers so little they barely can afford to pay income tax. So we do need to have a conversation about what is a more just and more equal society. And again, to be a bit smart economically, who's going to buy our goods if we pay people a slave wage?
Yeah. So if the CEOs of the Banking Association of South Africa meets tomorrow, what should they resolve on?
I think they could pay their workers better. They themselves as CEOs could pay themselves a little bit less. But the most important two things they could do is to say, what can they do to help grow the economy, to help spur economic investments, job creation? What can they do from the front to provide more accessible access to finance to SMEs? And of course, I think the investments should really be aimed at not only reckless, but how to support job creation. You're not going to sustain a society, as the former president of Mbeki said, if we have 1 out of 2 people being unemployed, if we have 3 out of 4 young people being unemployed. And even those who are employed are highly indebted, are drowning in debt, and are just not surviving to month end.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, Matthew Parks. Really do appreciate it. Rela Suskin, really do appreciate your time as well. It's been a very productive conversation. Thank you so much for that. Give us a call. The number is 011 714 2006. What are your reflections coming out of that conversation? 011 714 2006. I'm also taking your voice notes in a very short while on 0614 104 107. Let's take a quick, very short break, and then on the other side of this, we'll have a listen to some of your voice notes.
The SABC News Portal is your one-stop digital platform for all the news you need. Stay connected with the latest and breaking stories. Listen to all SABC radio stations live, including podcasts, and also watch the SABC News channel with clips and live streams of all the big news events. Simply download the SABC News app on your smartphone from the Play or App Store. SABC News, independent and impartial. For unskippable, no-click baiting, and cookie-free, with lots of real followers and likes, place your sales campaign on SAfm. Radio is still the best place to advertise your business at affordable rates. SAfm, with its national footprint and top personalities, offer advertisers distinctive opportunities to reach their target audience. Email sales@safm.co.za. SAfm, the influencer you can trust. SMS SAfm now on 41391. Call us on 011 714 2006.
And we are also taking your WhatsApp voice notes on 0614 104 107. I'm taking your tweet as well at Oliver_speaking. Just having a slight problem with the WhatsApp line, but as soon as that's back up, we'll have a listen to some of your voice notes, which have come through on the WhatsApp voice note line. In fact, there it is. Oh, it's back up. Oh, that's beautiful. Let's have a listen to some of your voice notes.
Hi, this is JK from the Western Cape. The big problem, and this is obviously discussion SAfm will never have, is the failure of the economic system that we have. This is an economic system that can only survive on creating poverty. If we don't create poverty once in a while, this economic system don't succeed. It is all to save the banks, because capitalism has failed over and over again. It won't create jobs, and it won't address poverty. It's the failure, it's a system that has failed over and over. Thank you.
Yeah, hello, Radio South Africa. I'm really flabbergasted of what the government, which is led by ANC, is doing. When we took government in 1994, companies such as Sasol just deteriorated. There were heavily refinery there. We know we buy crude oil from Iran. Then we refine it in Vereeniging. So now everything is closed. Now when Ukraine is fighting with Russia, and we're not buying any oil and crude oil or anything from Russia or wheat from Ukraine. Now, if Uncle Sam is coughing, the ruling party, which is the government of South Africa, now they increase the repo rate. They don't think of the poor men on the ground, and they don't think about the looting that they've done. I think it's a shame. We are leaderless here in this country. Submission, Ramudala Pope.
Dumela Oliver and your crew. Oliver, you are right if you say runaway inflation, in the sense that these prices that are skyrocketing could be described as runaway. You see, lovely brother, now the electric price increases like there's no tomorrow. I'm glad that Hammond, that is Society, has partnered with the minister, who's the minister of the minister, Pravin Gordon. Maybe scarce transfer to ESCOM will do the South Africans good. Maybe this electric price and the prices of everything that is pushed up by the ongoing war in Ukraine, the prices maybe will decrease. Good evening, Dr. Brother. Housing from Bramfish.
Good evening to you, Oliver. Good evening to the listeners. I think you should let the listeners know that every 10 years, decade, the Reserve Bank makes 1.3 trillion rands of us. That money does not come back into the system. It goes to the shareholders of the Reserve Bank, the capitalist system. 1.3 trillion will take you 30 years to count that money if you're counting 100 rand a second. Let the listeners know about that. Thank you. We're paying for the failures of the ANC government. Why has the rand depreciated? Because of state capture and junk status. Thank you. Chapter 2.
Well, technically, no. Being a Reserve Bank shareholder is not a very lucrative and profitable exercise. Have a look at the Reserve Bank. Have a look at the part of the Constitution that speaks to the Reserve Bank and itself, the Reserve Bank Constitution, around shareholders. There's a prescribed number of shares you can have as a shareholder. There's a limit to that. And there's a limit even to the dividends on those shares. And I calculated it. If there's a dividend payout cycle, as a shareholder, you make really no more than 100,000 rand. If you own the maximum amount of shares that a single person can own in the Reserve Bank, it's not a very lucrative exercise, to be quite honest. I'm not sure why the Reserve Bank still has shareholders, given that it really is, for the most part, ceremonial to be a Reserve Bank shareholder. It's not about the money, I guess. It's about, I guess, bragging rights, saying, I've got shares in the Reserve Bank. I'm not sure why that's the case. But let's take a quick break. On the other side of this, we speak to Sanusha Naidoo, who's a foreign policy analyst at the Institute for Global Dialogue. We're going to be speaking about Sri Lanka.
SAfm, leading the conversation. This week today, Fridays, 6 to 7 p.m.
Sri Lanka has a new Prime Minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe. I hope I'm saying that correct. It's a very long surname. Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe was sworn in on Wednesday this week after what I would call a people-led uprising, or what Thabo Mbeki would call Sri Lanka's Arab Spring. And they now have a new Prime Minister. Does this mean that people-led revolutions can overthrow a government if more than 100,000 people show up and invade the palace and make it uncomfortable and nearly impossible for a government to function in that space? Because this happened in Sri Lanka, it happened in Tunisia, it happened in Morocco, it happened in Egypt, it happened in Libya, bar for the American invasion there, but it happened in so many places that it's almost foolproof. Will it happen here? That's an interesting conversation, but perhaps not the most important conversation right now. The most important conversation, Sunisha, is what does this mean for Sri Lankan recovery and stability?
Good evening, Oliver. I think you've raised very fundamental questions. Sri Lanka is a very small country. It's an island state. It only has a population of 22 million people. And much of its economy relies on tourism and, of course, on remittance, because there is the whole migrant labor or the labor that goes into the Gulf states, into other parts of the region that basically rely on remittance. And so when COVID hit that economy really hard. And so you have a situation in Sri Lanka where you've got a new president in the form of Wickremesinghe, who's been in the political landscape since the 1970s in terms of Sri Lanka's political landscape, and of course he has been through many iterations as a person in the political power space, and so he has to now make sure that the country has the kind of economic reforms to bring about stability in order for them to have some kind of level of economic bailout from, say, the IMF, looking at the question around how do you create jobs, how do you create stability in the market, how do you create investment in terms of the economic program. And right now, as we're speaking, people in Sri Lanka are looking for basically to try and leave the country to find their economic stability outside. So you've got 24-hour services in terms of providing passports, in terms of providing all kinds of immigration documents, etc., for people to be able to find jobs wherever they can, go into the Gulf states. And people want, there's just no level of economic activity happening in the country. People are basically in a very dire situation, either trying to get to the US, either trying to get to Saudi Arabia or to some of the Middle Eastern countries, which have a large migration labor process, and willing to do any kind of job so that they can actually send back some money home to take care of the family that's there. So I'm not sure what the president is going to be doing in terms of putting the country on the kind of economic recovery that it should be, because on an island of 22 million people, where people are starving, there's no economic activity. The main tourist industry has been shattered by COVID. This is where we are, and I think this is something that we have to be very careful of in terms of the kind of political ruling class that actually left a severe imprint on the economy of the country.
Would you say Sri Lanka is worse than Zimbabwe 2008?
I think you've got to be careful in trying to draw the kind of parallels. You've got to look at structural conditions. You've got to look at what's going on in terms of the political ruling class. You've got to look at a number of things. But I think if you're talking in a very broad outline, Oliver, then you're obviously going to be raising the question about, is Sri Lanka worse off than Zimbabwe, or is Sri Lanka worse off than its neighbors in its regional neighborhood in South Asia? And I think that's something that has to be really critical in understanding. I don't think that we could draw the parallels to say one country is worse off than the other. I think it's really around the conditions that are in that country and where they are going to be going. Right now, families are basically camping outside of the equivalent of Home Affairs offices in Colombo, the capital, not willing to even leave the line because they're so afraid that they'll lose their place in the queue to get a passport, because they just want to get out of the country.
Yeah. Ranil Wickremesinghe, you say, has been part of the political establishment for an incredibly long time, since the 70s or 80s, as you said. So is this a real transition in power? And if it is, where is it from and to? I have no idea which political party Ranil is from. I have no idea which political party the former prime minister who fled the country is from. Describe to us the political landscape in Sri Lanka?
Well, Sri Lanka has been under instability. I mean, if you go back to the early 90s and even in terms of the 80s, there was the whole question of the identity of the Tamil minority group in Sri Lanka. And many have been arguing that civil war between the Tamilians and the Sinhalese, which is the ethnic groups, etc., in Sri Lanka, they've had this incredible strife in terms of the Tamilians asking for their own kind of independent state. So you had the Tamil Tigers, which was very much part of that whole insurgency and attack and etc. And for the longest time ever, Sri Lanka was under this instability. And then, of course, you had this diaspora that sprung out from the instability as well, where there was the whole Tamilian community that moved into various parts of the diaspora, and of course also tried to talk about the identity of the Tamilian group in Sri Lanka that were being oppressed by the Sinhalese government. So what happened was that in the late 90s and in the noughties, so to speak, you had this kind of incredible military suppression, and where they were able to suppress the LTTE, they were able to basically push back the whole kind of secession debate. And of course, the Rajapaksa family have been in power for 2 decades. And they were quite a militaristic family in a sense. They were the ones that kind of took the glory to say we brought stability to Sri Lanka out of the civil war and the civil strife. But of course, the problem is that Mr. Wickremesinghe has been in this establishment, this political ruling class, and he also has this alliance with the former Rajapaksa family. And they are seen as part and parcel of why Sri Lanka is now in this economic crisis, because of the way they try to also utilize the space for their own personal needs and selfish interests, and utilizing the same old debates we're having in South Africa on that. And so The Economist wrote a very interesting piece, I think it was in this current edition, about whether Wickremesinghe is actually going to create a new kind of trajectory in the political landscape of reform, stability, and move the country away from the kind of old that has been symbolized by the Rajapaksa family. But of course, the demonstrators that stormed the presidential palace, and we saw them swimming in the pool and just having a kind of interesting way in which people felt that the privilege in Sri Lanka was being denied to everybody. Yeah. They made very big demands, and I'm not sure whether the president will actually be able to deliver on that in terms of the executive presidential authority that currently structures the political landscape and the body politic in Sri Lanka. And so one of the things is that they didn't want him as to be elected by the parliament. They actually demanded for him to resign as well because of his association, and they were burning effigies of him in Colombo. And then, of course, he unleashed the military and the police as well. I mean, especially the police, where those tents that were outside the presidential palace, and where they were linked in terms of on the gardens and on outskirts of the residential home of the president, you found that those were all then destroyed by the police, and people were then dispersed. And so you got a handful of people that are still out there trying to protest. But of course, what is interesting as well is that whether he'll be able to deliver what the demands are of the protesters, and whether we'll see
what are those
react to that.
Very briefly, in the last few minutes we have, what are some of those demands?
So they want to have a complete kind of renewal of the political landscape. They don't want these kinds of political ruling families to be there in power. They want basically Mr. Wickremesinghe to resign. They don't want him there because they feel that he has been in collusion with the former presidential family. And most importantly, they want the kind of the opening up of the economic space. But the problem is that there's a reform package that talks about privatization, increasing corporate tax, personal tax, privatizing state-owned enterprises, and trying to align to what the IMF good governance principles are. And then there's the challenge of the debt, and what the debt is in terms of how much does Sri Lanka owe to its external multilateral and bilateral debtors.
Yeah. Is there appetite in the global East for a Sri Lankan bailout, given that where most of these Sri Lankas will flee to will likely be India? Maybe not Pakistan, given the history, but would be India, would be Singapore, would be Malaysia. Surely those countries now have to ask themselves, do we have the capacity to take on 22 million Sri Lankans?
Well, I think one of the big challenges for Sri Lanka is whether or not the economic migrants are able to get to those spaces where they were working before in terms of migrant labor. So that's the big question, and that's not necessarily in India. There is a Sri Lankan community in Singapore, in Malaysia, etc. But I think it's more to the economic attraction in the Gulf states, and of course maybe to Australia. The other point to make is the role that China plays in all of this as well. I think India is worried about the refugee crisis if it does end up on its doorstep, because it's 30 kilometers off the coast of Sri Lanka. That's how close India is in terms of the south. And of course for China, it's going to be the question around the Chinese president today said that he believes that they could reform, but he's talking about also the question around how their interests are there in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative and the debt question.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, Sonisha Naidu. Really, really do appreciate your insight.
Pleasure.
That is Sonisha Naidu. Let's take some of your calls. 011-714-2006. Some of your voice notes on 0614-104-107. Let's speak to Yunus out in Johannesburg. Yunus, good evening.
Yeah, hi there. Regarding the Sri Lankan story, your guest just spoke about the Chinese. and their interests there. Now, what has happened there is there's a port there called Hambantota, which the Chinese have redeveloped that port. And Sri Lanka reneged on the payments there. So the Chinese have actually taken over that port. It belongs to China now.
Yeah.
So moral of the story is, and Sri Lanka owes the World Bank and IMF hundreds of millions of dollars. Moral of the story, coming back in comparison with us, the amount of money we have borrowed from the World Bank and IMF, there's, the short and curly of the story is there's nothing for mahala. You've got to pay back.
Yeah,
and
I don't think so. I don't
get into that debt.
I don't think South Africa's on the precipice of debt default, right? But Sri Lanka certainly was.
Not yet. Yes,
Yeah.
but not yet. And coming back quickly to the Rajapaksas, one story that the world has forgotten is that your guest alluded to that, the war with the Tamil Tigers in the north.
Yeah.
There were thousands and thousands of Tamilian civilians that were killed there.
Yeah.
Human Rights Watch and all of them alluded to that. Violations, you can name it, and they've got away with that. So what goes around comes around. And where's he going now? To settle in Dubai. So which tells you millions and millions of dollars he siphoned out of the country.
Yunus, thank you so much for your call. Really, really do appreciate it.
And Vikramasinga, I don't think the public's got much confidence in him anyway.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your call, Yunus. Really do appreciate it. Let's take a voice note.
Good evening, Oliver. Good evening to the listeners of SAfm. Gwasant. Yes, Sri Lanka has the new president. As part of the package for the coming new president is the rationing of fuel. So I don't know how it works, but I'm informed that you can't just buy fuel as you like. I don't know if this is going to be a trend across the globe when this Ukraine-Russia war continues. We are headed for the very, very, very tough times. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, fuel rationing is not a new thing. Parts of the world have had it. South Africa had its own little fuel rationing last year. I don't know if you recall, during the July unrest. I recall not being able to access petrol, and when I did, I was limited to I don't think more than 15 liters at the time by the local petrol station where I live. So we certainly should not be alarmist, but that is a possibility that could become a part of our reality. That brings us to the end of the show. It's been fantastic being in your company. Let's continue the conversations on social media. It's at Oliver_speaking, Oliver Dickson on Facebook. And I'll be back with you next week. We've got a special broadcast coming for you next week. Announcements on that will be made on Monday. Thank you so much for your time. It's 7 p.m. Time for your news with Greg Khosa.
Independent and impartial. This is SAfm News.
Thank you, Oliver. In this news update, reassurances over Gupta extradition and Ramaphosa answers Phala questions. Good evening.